Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 1 March 2024. It is the 166th anniversary of the birth of Georg Simmel, who was born in Berlin on this date in 1858. Simmel was a sociologist who also wrote on the philosophy of history, and I know of at least one other sociologist who also wrote on philosophy of history, the Scottish sociologist Robert M. McIver, and he was influenced by Simmel. I also mentioned in my episode on Voegelin and Husserl that Voegelin was in correspondence with both Alfred Schutz, who applied the phenomenological method to sociology, and Talcott Parsons, who was one of the most influential sociologists of the 20th century. And Schutz was also in correspondence with Parsons. So the 20th century saw a certain degree of exchange between sociology and philosophy of history. And you could say that Simmel was on the leading edge of that, born pretty much in the middle of the 19th century. Some sociologists see their discipline very broadly as the study of everything human, you could say, and Simmel definitely had very broad interests. It's easy to see how this big picture conception of human institutions would inevitably touch on philosophy of history. Simmel published the first edition of his The Problems of Philosophy of History, an epistemological essay, in 1892. A second revised edition was published in 1904, and another slight revision was published in 1907. Simmel started planning a second edition of another edition in 1913 and wrote about it to Heinrich Rickert, who was himself a philosopher of history, in 1916. Simmel was at work on an entirely rewritten fourth edition in 1918 when he received the news that he had terminal liver cancer, and he used the remainder of his life to work on his final metaphysical testament. Simmel, we can see, had been working on philosophy of history for decades, for most of his life. And in his letter to Rickert, Simmel wrote, quote, "I am working on the fourth edition of my philosophy of history. However, this will not be a new edition, but rather a completely different book with a different title. Also, in the course of years, my views and attitudes on these problems have completely altered. They have become much more radical and atrociously complicated. In consequence, I have no idea when all this work will be completed," unquote. And due to his final illness, it never was completed. In one of the aphorisms that is appended to his final work that he completed instead of finishing the fourth edition of his philosophy of history book, Simmel wrote, quote, "In human history, the precursor assumes a distinctive place. Insofar as the idea of evolution dominates, each person is a precursor, but really also a fulfiller. In the form of ethical principles, each exists beside the other. One should behave as though he were the precursor of all fulfillers and as though he were the fulfiller of all precursors," unquote. This could be used as an answer to Voegelin's critique of Husserl, which I discussed in my episode of the two, where history is wrapped up in moral concerns to a significant degree, as we also saw in the case with Ernst Troeltsch, who saw ethics and philosophy of history together as the tools that would allow humanity to transcend the dilemmas it had gotten itself into. The moral motive in interpreting history is usually pervasively present, but rarely made explicit. So we should be grateful when somebody actually does openly acknowledge their moral motives in trying to understand history. As many philosophers of history have contributed to the elaboration of an ideal historical objectivity, seeking to act upon Max Weber's ideal of value-free scientific methodology as applied to history, and with Weber, again, we see the influence of sociology. The alternative view represented by Rickert, with whom Simmel was in correspondence, that history is inconceivable without the recognition of value-laden facts, appears as a kind of betrayal of the idea of a scientific history. Voegelin, in his criticism of Husserl, contrasted Husserl unfavorably to Kant, since Voegelin thought that Husserl was prepared to dismiss everything prior to phenomenology as mere prelude, whereas Kant recognized this problem and had at least expressed disquiet over it. This is all a generation later, though, and Simmel's formulation from years earlier, which would have every individual view themselves as a precursor and fulfillment to come, but at the same time, the fulfillment of precursors past gives us a way to think about moral obligation within a historical continuum in which each individual can represent only one stage of development. If we understand history teleologically, then everyone prior to the fulfillment of the telos, that is the end or aim, is out of luck, and everyone afterwards has won the historical equivalent of the lottery. John Dewey had said something similar in a short work on axiology, in which he posited what he called an ends-means continuum, in which every end is a means to a future end. I'm not going to pursue this at the present time, but it would be worthwhile to consider it in this connection. Dewey uses different language, but it's very much a similar idea. Simmel takes up teleology in his problems in the philosophy of history, and at the same time, he takes up the moral motivations in history. Chapter 3, section 3 is titled The Constitutive Status of Extra Theoretical Interests in History. And these extra theoretical interests include moral interests. Quote, both ethics and aesthetics generate principles of periodization, stages of evolution, speculative ideas concerning a deeper meaning of the historical event, teleological points of culmination, in short, reflections on history. But there is no sense in which they alter the construct of historical reality. On the contrary, they only express the way in which certain affective or axiological interests are satisfied in this construct, unquote. Simmel erects a distinction between a purely theoretical history and a speculative or metaphysical philosophy of history, which seems to supervene on a theoretical history. And in the following passage that I'm going to quote, Simmel reiterates this distinction, but then he immediately undercuts it. Quote, the reflections which are speculative and extra-theoretical interests cast on the results of historical investigation are, of course, the elements of a metaphysics of history. The perspective of the metaphysics of history is entirely different from the theoretical description of the historical event itself. The legitimacy of a metaphysics of history, the justification of its existence within the scientific division of labor, is based on a rigorous and absolute distinction between metaphysics and the problematic of theoretical history, unquote. And now comes a point at which he undercuts this whole distinction, which he's just formulated. Quote, on the other hand, pure history is an ideal that is never completely realized. In fact, metaphysical categories are implicated in theoretical history. For the most part, speculation about history is simply a more exact definition, elucidation, and logical classification of presuppositions and motive forces that are already present in the formation of the raw material of events into history itself. The genesis of historical speculation cannot be fully understood unless we follow its fragmentary beginnings, its partial efficacy, and its development, often hidden in the more simple and concrete propositions of history itself, unquote. So if pure theory, which in this context is purely theoretical history, is an ideal never realized in fact, then this theoretical history is no less ideal than a metaphysics of history. And if metaphysical categories are implicated in theoretical history, and if speculative philosophy of history is already present in the raw material of history, then metaphysics is intrinsic to substantive history and is not a construct that merely supervenes upon history, which can be safely ignored. So in the space of a few paragraphs, we've seen Simmel go from an absolute distinction between theoretical and extra-theoretical interest in history to a graded continuum in which a metaphysics of history is implicit within history itself and is made explicit through definition, elucidation, and logical classification. Simmel takes aesthetics and ethics together as axiological, extra-theoretical interests in history. But there are also teleological, extra-theoretical interests in history, where teleological, extra-theoretical interests are the convergence upon some end or purpose, as discussed earlier in relation to Voegelin's criticisms of Husserl. The distinction between means and ends requires that there be an end, that is to say, a purpose, and this passage by way of means to get to the end is teleology. Almost all substantive or speculative philosophies of history have involved some kind of teleology. Providential philosophies of history involve human history fulfilling a divine purpose. Later Enlightenment philosophies of history involve human history fulfilling the promise of progress. And Hegel's philosophy of history is perhaps the most famous, or if you prefer, the most notorious. And its theme is the development of absolute spirit in human history. And this is, again, a teleological process. Usually we find purpose and value together. That is to say, teleological and axiological interests usually coincide. However, Simmel makes an important distinction between a teleological view and an axiological view, taking each in isolation to demonstrate that value can be had without purpose and purpose can be had without value, even if we usually find that the two coincide. So I'm going to make several quotes here, interspersed with some short remarks to make my point. So first, he makes a distinction. Quote, "We should not suppose that a teleological view of history and a valuative or axiological view are interchangeable. Quite often, both views coincide, and it often happens that the inner animation which history acquires as a result of its organization by reference to purposes is intimately related to the development of an axiological perspective. Nevertheless, the logical structure of the concepts of purpose and value is completely different. Moreover, the import which these two concepts have for the philosophy of history need not be equivalent," unquote. So after that, Simmel shows that there can be fulfillment of purpose in which the value experienced is purely epiphenomenal. That is to say, it arises by mere historical accident and is not intrinsic to the process of the realization of the purpose. Quote, "It is certainly logically possible to suppose that the objective cosmic process culminates in some sort of purpose which an immanent or transcendent power has imputed to it without inscribing a value to the purpose itself. Value could be ascribed to some stage along the path to it. There are innumerable moments in history with which a feeling or sense of some value is associated. Countless times this feeling tells us that for the sake of a certain deed or a certain sentiment, it would actually be worthwhile to set the entire apparatus of history in motion with all of its suffering and negative values. Yet we are also convinced that the mechanism of history does not function for the sake of these moments, but rather in the interest of other future or more comprehensive purposes," unquote. So that is purpose with value, but the value is merely accidental to the purpose. He also considers the case, which we could say is justified by the method of isolation, so as to find valueless purpose in its pure form. The case in which there is fulfillment of purpose without even epiphenomenal value. Quote, "In addition, it would be possible to ascribe an objective purposiveness in the process of history and deny that it has any value at all. For example, we might suppose that from a relative standpoint, the world is as good and as purposive as it can be. From an absolute standpoint, however, it could be ordered as badly as possible, so badly that it lies beneath the 0 point of value," unquote. And then he gives us the opposite scenario, the possibility of value without purpose. Quote, "Finally, we could deny that history exhibits any purposiveness at all and still ascribe value to it. For example, we could ascribe value to one of its aspects or to history as a whole," unquote. I haven't seen this distinction made elsewhere, but I think it's a very valuable one. And we need to see it in light of the history of the idea of purpose. So ever since Aristotle, we have understood purpose and value as being intimately bound up in one another. So right at the beginning of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he wrote, quote, "Of all things which may be done, there is some one end which we desire for its own sake, and with a view to which we desire everything else. And since we do not choose in all instances with a further end in view, for then men would go on without limit, and so the desire would be unsatisfied and limit fruitless, this plainly must be the chief good, that is, the best thing of all," unquote. So there are many things which are good only as a means, and they derive what good they have from the end which is desired for its own sake. So today we would say that the end that's desired for its own sake has intrinsic value or is intrinsically valuable. That which is a means to an intrinsically valuable end is valued because it is a means to realizing this value and not as an end in itself. If we call an intrinsically valuable end a purpose, and the striving to attain the purpose the means, then purpose and intrinsic value coincide. Aristotle was writing about ethics, but the same problem is found in history. So again, we see the interaction of ethics and history. If history is understood teleologically, then the telos, or end, is the purpose that is intrinsically valuable. And the whole of historical striving to realize that purpose, whether the purpose is divine providence or progress in this world, is the means to that end. This is the problem that Voegelin attributed to Husserl, and which Voegelin thought that Kant had barely escaped. But if we make the distinction, as Simmel does, between teleology and axiology, this could be used to blunt Voegelin's criticism of Husserl, or indeed to blunt the criticism that any philosophy of history that suggests that most of history is given over to those who are simply out of luck because they lived and died before the ultimate aim of history was realized, and the lucky few who live after the end of history enjoy the benefits without having to put in the effort to make it happen. A lot more could be said about this. For example, in light of Nietzsche's sketch of the last men of history, which I mentioned in the episode on Paul Ricoeur, living after the end of history is not necessarily the same thing as having won the historical lottery. As Nietzsche describes the end of history, it would be much better to live before the end of history than to be part of the generation striving to attain that end than to be that pathetic last man at the end of history. And I think the argument can be made for the scenario that Simmel formulated, in which value is merely epiphenomenal, in which a closer examination would reveal that these values are actually intrinsic to the striving toward realizing the end. And if this is the case, then Voegelin's criticism of Husserl can be blunted in a different way. And I think this is a way that accords better with common sense. We've all heard many times that the journey itself is the destination, and the point of it all was the friends we made along the way. And philosophy of history needs to be able to incorporate this kind of folk wisdom on pain of its irrelevance if it fails to do so. Not only does this accord with common sense, it also accords with Simmel's own response to his distinction between theoretical history and speculative history that I quoted above, such that metaphysical categories are implicated in theoretical history. That is to say, an axiology of history is implicit within even the most austerely positivist conception of theoretical history. That in itself would be a focus for a lengthy inquiry. So there's a lot more that could be said about this, but for the time being, I'm going to leave it there. And just note that Simmel's achievement in philosophy of history, with the first edition of his book being printed at the end of the 19th century, is an almost unique contribution. I don't know of any other comparably sophisticated formulation of the problems of the philosophy of history coeval with or prior to Simmel's work. Raymond Aron's book, with which it could be profitably compared, is a whole generation later, with the first edition published in the 30s. And Simmel published his first edition in the 1890s. So that shows you how far ahead Simmel was of the curve. So happy birthday, Georg Simmel, and thanks for listening.